this can now be considered part 2 of our program. Okay? So turn please to chapter 3. Maybe the most famous quotation of the book of Ecclesiastes is the first 8 verses of chapter 3. You may know the song, Turn, Turn, Turn. Well, Turn, Turn, Turn is not in the original, but as we saw from chapter 1, the idea of turning and returning is characteristic of the thought of the preacher, of the convener. Chapter 3. Again, you're probably familiar with the Revised Standard Version. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, or if you prefer, a time for every purpose under heaven. Now here is the New Jewish Publication Society's translation. A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born, and a time for dying, a time for planting, and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. So this is an observation. This isn't yet the conclusion that comes from the observation. We have some youngins who could stand to learn that there is a time to refrain from embracing. And we have some people who don't have the excuse of being youngins who need to learn the same lesson. It's a little disconcerting to hear the preacher saying a time for hating and a time for loving. Some of us would like to go through life and never experience hate. I don't know if that's attainable. A time for war and a time for peace. Wouldn't we wish for a time that is a day of complete peace? Right? Well, Qoheleth certainly is living in pre-messianic times, where the nation shall not lift up sword against nation certainly had not come true then, if it has indeed come true since then. One or two words about the individual specifics. A time for ripping and a time for sowing. That could be true. Trivially, what do you make of that in a sense beyond the immediate observation? Do you think it stands for something, the ripping and the sowing? Lois, is it Lois? Yes, what would you say?
Yes. Well, anything that needs to be built involves taking apart and putting together. So, for example, making a garment, you need to separate some fabric and also put things together. So in the same way, when navigating around truth, you need to be able to divide between what is true and what is false and put together connections that have meaning.
I agree with you. In my graduate school, in my rabbinical school curriculum, the framers of the curriculum, broadly speaking, followed a path of starting with analysis and then continuing with synthesis. So the analysis quite literally is taking apart, and the synthesis quite literally is assembling a whole which reflects what we've learned. This also sounds a little bit like the commissioning of the prophet Jeremiah. If you remember, Jeremiah first has to tear down, and then he has to plant. So sometimes we need to clear the building site of rubble before we can begin to build. Now, in the rabbinic reading, there's a very specific application of a time to rip and a time to sow. And it has to do with bereavement and healing. The Jewish response to death in one's proximity. If you're in the room when someone dies, or if you've heard that a relative has died. The first response is to tear your clothing. And the rabbis say you tear the clothing ad sheyigale libo, until you reveal the heart. Because you're expressing tangibly that you have a broken heart. So the rabbis understand the time for tearing as the time to express grief, time to go into grief, which is the very first stage of mourning. And the time for sowing for them means the process of healing, when you work through the stages of grief and you ultimately are in another place, but a place where once again you're saying yes to life. So that's just one little example of kind of an atomistic exegesis. Let's step back from that point, and again ask what is his overall point. There's a time for everything. Now, do you control that time? For Qoheleth, there's not much control. Because for Qoheleth, God is all-powerful, but also inscrutable. And God being inscrutable leaves it looking from our perspective as arbitrary. I don't think he's saying that it's arbitrary, but I think he's saying that since we can't divine the reason, it feels arbitrary. Contrast this with Psalm number 145, Psalm of David. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised. His greatness is unsearchable. Unsearchable. We have a story in my congregation that there was a particular 13-year-old boy, he's a leader in the local business community today, who was leading that psalm on his bar mitzvah, and he was very nervous. So he said, great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unscratchable. And the rabbi, who was well known for being very quick on the uptake, Rabbi Goldman of blessed memory, made an impromptu sermon on that. The boy's name was Alan. He said, Alan, you know, that could be true. What would it mean to say that God is unscratchable? And so on and so forth. And we still tell the story 50 years later. So great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. But if you read that entire psalm, God's unsearchability isn't depressing. It's ultimately reassuring. For Qoheleth, it's somewhat depressing. But I want to once again go back to this notion that we need to get over ourselves. We need to stop looking at everything from the standpoint where we are right at center stage, and understand a little bit about what that would do to our God language. And here I want to paraphrase a quotation from St. Thomas Aquinas. The point of the quotation that I'm about to give you is to show how Qoheleth is a witness, not the only witness, but he is a biblical witness to the mystery of God. So now, to paraphrase Aquinas, when the existence of a thing has been ascertained, there remains the further question of the manner of its existence, in order that we may know its essence. Now, because we cannot know what God is, but rather what God is not, Aquinas says he is not, we have no means for considering how God is, but rather how God is not. Therefore, we must consider 1, how God is not, 2, how God is known by us, 3, how God is named. And that quotation is from the Summa, Part 1, Question 3. So if we don't know God, we know what God is not, then we have to reckon with the fact that what we say about God may often have more to say about ourselves. And this is, of course, Freud's basic critique of religion. You want and need, or think you need, a warm fuzzy. So you talk about God who is warm and fuzzy. Well, I don't agree with Freud that God is simply a concoction, an illusion is his precise word. But I do accept as an important caution that let's be very careful before we anthropomorphize God, because then we really will be guilty of violating the Ten Commandments. We're going to be creating an image of the finite and shoving God into that image. Of course, that's very, very dangerous, because once God isn't really bigger than your image of God, then it's so convenient to use that to have God justify whatever you want, even it's a base instinct. Abraham Lincoln understood this. In Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, he remarked about how odd it is that both sides of the conflict are praying to the same God, confident that God is answering their prayers. And President Lincoln said, God could not answer both as they wanted, and perhaps answered neither as they wanted. So it's very dangerous to be too free and easy with cutting God down to the knowable. And the inscrutability of God that Qoheleth emphasizes is a good corrective against that. So it's a little bit like making a sweet and sour soup. Qoheleth might be the sour part of the recipe, but you wouldn't want the recipe to lack it completely. Now, I want to move on to what Qoheleth has to say about some practical matters. Specifically, wealth, and the fact that you can't take it with you. So, let's look at chapter 5 now. Well, it looks as if there's a slight difference of verse enumeration. In the Revised Standard, it's verse 10. Because the Revised Standard gives us, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with gain. This also is vanity." And Ginsburg gives us, "A lover of money never has his fill of money, nor a lover of wealth his fill of income. That too is futile." I remember having a conversation with a college friend who went on. At first, he was a very successful attorney and bringing in a lot of money. And then he decided to forego a great deal of income, and he became quite a distinguished professor of constitutional law at the Sandra Day O'Connor Law School of the Arizona State University. Very, very fine thinker. But I remember having a walk with him on the streets of Manhattan when he was still in his make a lot of money phase. And his first name is Jim. I said, he was telling me about this and that, and how he hopes to accomplish this after his next raise, and so on and so forth. And I was a graduate student, just getting by. And I said to him, well, Jim, how much would be enough? And he said, more. And I said, my friend, you will not have enough, because there's always more. Years later, I had opportunity to be in Arizona, and I had a delightful pre-Thanksgiving meal with Jim and his wife, who's a very distinguished psychiatrist, and their children. And he reminded me that we'd had that conversation decades before, and that when he contemplated what his classmates were doing in terms of the earning, and where he was, he knew that he was, well towards the bottom of that ranking, and yet he was content. Which reminded me then of a rabbinic statement. Rabbi Simon ben Zoma says, "Ezehu ashir hasameach bechelko, Who is wealthy? He who is happy with what he has. Please.
Did you say that the person who pursues knowledge will also never have enough?
Yes, yes. Well, but that's not so bad. I mean, who wants to be a know-it-all? What's left to strive for? But Qoheleth does talk about that even in wisdom, you get disappointed. I'll never know this, I'll never know that. But you can get disappointed for another way. I know everything that I know, and I can't take that with me either. Remember that the horizon for Qoheleth does not include what became very popular and characteristic both of later Judaism and of Christianity, which is a vision that encompasses this world and the world to come. As Rabbi Jacob said in the rabbinic era, this world is like an entrance foyer, the world to come like a great banqueting hall. So what do you do when you get into the entrance foyer? You check that your tie is straight, you check that your hair is right, and then you're ready to make your entrance, right? So Rabbi Jacob said, prepare yourself in the entrance foyer so that you may properly enter the banqueting hall. And in the parables of Jesus, you have so much about heaven as a goal. Qoheleth doesn't live in a world where that's the way that people think. So he's forced to reckon with the fact that you're not going to take it with you. So continuing in chapter 5, verse 12. Again, your verse number may be one verse off. Here is a grave evil I have observed under the sun, riches hoarded by their owner to his misfortune, in that those riches are lost in some unlucky venture. Right? It could happen. And then later on in Qoheleth, where you have it, and you're wise, but your son is an idiot. And he squanders it. It happens. That's the problem with dynasties, right? The founders of dynasties work hard, make something from little, right? They are Horatio Alger. And their kids are born on third base. And they think they've hit a triple. You know that expression, right? They're already born on third base and they think they've hit a triple. So they don't have the self-discipline that got their parents to the position of being able to give so much to the kids. And Qoheleth knows all about that. Now, let's move towards what his conclusion is. Because he's not a nihilist, he doesn't believe in empty carousing, he's not a libertine. He feels that you should be pious enough. Don't be some kind of crazy zealot, but be pious enough. And here I'm going to show you where he talks about this. Let's look now at chapter 7. Starting at verse 15. In my own brief span of life, we don't know how old he was, but life is brief. And when you're at a certain point, you say, gee, yesterday I was just setting out on a career, right? And now look where, so in my brief span of life, I've seen both these things. Sometimes a good man perishes in spite of his goodness. Now, of course, we know that, but there's a lot of Bible that you got to go through before someone just says it calmly like that. And sometimes a wicked one endures in spite of his wickedness. Now, Job's 3 friends, just to anticipate, don't seem to know this lesson. Right? His 3 friends, his 3 companions, his 3 interlocutors, give him a kind of a conventional, yes, it's all for the best. Oh, Job, you must have sinned. And Job says, I don't see it. So we're going to get to that, but Qoheleth is already of the mind of Job. It happens sometimes. Bad things happen to good people. And the converse, bad people get away with things. Right? Some of you know the author, Rabbi Harold Kushner. It's not often that a book of theology becomes for scores of weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. But in the mid-1970s, Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, achieved that. We're going to talk more about that book when we talk about Job, because Kushner talks about Job a lot. But Kushner came to town several times, and I remember having the pleasure of speaking with him when he was in town. By the way, I'm also friendly with his successor in the pulpit in Natick, Massachusetts, who told me that sometimes it's very hard to be the clergy who follows in the footsteps of the great man. But Kushner made it very, very easy. He said to my friend, look at my office, it says Rabbi Laureate. I'm not gunning for your job. So you be the rabbi here, I got what to do. So he's very kind in that way. Anyway, so Rabbi Kushner came here and mentioned that he goes around the country and people tell him with great enthusiasm that they've enjoyed a particular book, and he doesn't know why they're giving him credit for that book, because he never wrote that book. And he says they all walk up to me and they say, I'm so glad to have read Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. And Harold Kushner says, I never said that. My title is When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He doesn't attempt to explain them. So there's a certain posture of theological humility that I must say resonates a great deal in my soul. I don't know why children are born with birth defects. I mean, I can give you the chromosomal and the mitochondrial, which is just fancy language for saying that's how it happens, but we don't know why it happens. I don't know why. Qoheleth gives me some solace. He gives me the solace of knowing that I don't have to know why to be able to affirm that there is a God and to have a voice that I think is an authentic voice of protest, but then to decide, all in all, to get on with the business of living rightly. That's what I get from Qoheleth. So let me read that for you. This is a verse that can be easily misunderstood. Verse 16. So don't overdo goodness, and don't act the wise man to excess, or you may be dumbfounded. What does it mean to overdo goodness? I think this is what, we'll talk more about this in January. I think this is a little bit what Jesus is talking about when he says, those people who have their phylacteries, these tefillin, the little amulets that have the hero Israel in them. They're so proud of the big phylacteries that they have. Look at me, look at my piety. Qoheleth would say, take it easy. I used to work with a fellow at the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and on the morning of my rabbinic ordination, he said, his name was Sandy, he said, I'm going to give you some very good advice, Michael. And I said, I'm eager for good advice. He said, this morning, when you got up and you got dressed, you put your trousers on one leg at a time. Tomorrow morning, you'll be a rabbi, and you're going to get up and put on your trousers one leg at a time. That's Qoheleth wisdom here. Right? Understand that you have to get by in the world, and if you're a sociopath, you're not getting by in the world. Be a good person, but don't feel as if you have to climb the Mount Everest and then show off. That's what I get from that. And it's also true that people don't achieve in wisdom what they hope to achieve, but the quest is dignified. And Qoheleth reminds you that in the quest for wisdom, there are a lot of people who want to peddle intellectual snake oil. So that's verse 21. Finally, don't pay attention to everything that is said, so that you may not hear your slave reviling you. I know people who cannot be wrong. It's just inconceivable that they should be wrong. And in the end, of course, they go further and further and further out on the limb, and if they had a good friend, he would chop it off before they're too far out so that the fall becomes fatal. Do you know what a Roman triumph was? A Roman triumph is when the general, the victorious general, would come back to Rome and get the adulation of his fellow citizens. And we are told that at that triumph, the Roman general would have his face painted red like the god of war, or like the god Jupiter, and he would feel rather godlike at that one moment. But he had a slave right behind him in the chariot saying, "Remember that you are immortal. Remember that you are immortal. Remember that you are immortal." Not immortal, amortal. So Qoheleth reminds us that we are as a mote, right, in the vast sunbeam. We are as a drop in the ocean. And that is a little depressing, but if we can just get over ourselves, then Qoheleth can be bracing rather than depressing. I have to give you my favorite one. My favorite one, which has been proven true by so many committee meetings. Qoheleth starts off by telling us that things that look sad can actually be better than you think. He starts off by saying, "A good name is better than fragrant oil." This is well known because it's a pun in Hebrew. Name is Shem, fragrant oil is Shemen. Tov, Shem, the Shemen, Tov. It sounds very pretty in the Hebrew. And then he goes on to say, the day of death is better than the day of birth. That's counterintuitive, but Qoheleth tries to be counterintuitive. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. Now, there are several ways of understanding this. As a rabbi, I tell you how I understand it. A couple comes in, they want to get married. They're very, very concerned. How long is the service going to take? Because, you know, we've booked the DJ. Whereas at the house of mourning, I'm sure my clergy colleagues understand this. Sometimes you're asked questions that have no answers. Like, why did God take my so-and-so? It's okay that you're asked a question. You don't have to have the answer. But you know that you're important. You know you're needed. And you know that if you do your best to offer consolation, it's at least going to be listened to. Right? Whereas, you know, what are you going to be able to say over the DJ? But that's not what Qoheleth means by it's better to go to a house of mourning, although that is what a practicing rabbi takes from it. What Qoheleth means is similar to what you may have heard at a Masonic funeral. You ever gone to a Freemason's funeral? There's a very sonorous, resonant reading that's done at a Masonic funeral. And it starts off with the reader saying, there are countless reminders in our lives that our days are numbered. And we, through some foolishness, deny the significance of every one of them. If we lived in the awareness that our days are numbered, we could live more wisely. That's what Qoheleth actually means, and I completely agree. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, for that is the end of every man, and a living one should take it to heart.
What verse is that?
In my translation here, it's chapter 7, verse 2. Now, again, you can say, well, you know, life's going to end, so what's the point? Or you can say, you know, this German requiem that we heard, it was so beautiful. It lasted for a finite amount of time. It wasn't endless, but it's still worthwhile. And I also want to give you one other point that will develop when we get to our New Testament part of the study. Begin thinking about the difference between immortality and eternity. Begin thinking about those two different terms. The great theologian Paul Tillich taught his students to think about participating in eternity, which is to say, something of your life right now reflects eternal values. So, Qoheleth doesn't have a sense of personal immortality that came to characterize the religion the century and the 2 centuries that followed Qoheleth. But Qoheleth certainly has a sense of God as eternal. And we are always living in a world that's created by God. He never denies that. But what do I like about Qoheleth for committee meetings, verse 5 and following? It is better to listen to a wise man's reproof than to listen to the praise of fools. For the levity of the fool is like the crackling of nettles under the kettle. So sometimes people just talk nonsense. Now, we ought to look at the very end of Qoheleth because many people say this is the work of another editor. Chapter 12. Obviously, someone else is writing. This is third person. A further word, because Qoheleth was a sage, he continued to instruct the people. He listened to and tested the soundness of many maxims. Qoheleth sought to discover useful sayings and recorded genuinely truthful sayings. The sayings of the wise are like goads, like nails fixed in prodding stick. They were given by one shepherd. So this editor says, Qoheleth was a kind of an unconventional scholar, an unconventional sage. He was a gadfly. He went against a consensus. He was never afraid to do that. But he was part of that company. Think of some of the great Supreme Court justices who were distinguished initially by dissents and only later on were their opinions becoming part of the majority. Think, for example, of the great Justice Louis D. Brandeis, who at the beginning of his career was more often thought of as the great dissenter. And later on in his career, his dissents were then chosen as the basis for significant overturnings of previous consensus. Qoheleth went against the consensus of the wise, but he was part of that movement, and everyone understood it. And so in that spirit of understanding that this was a great man, he disagreed with us, but he's part of the larger circle that we are part of, and without his voice, we would be impoverished. The editor of Qoheleth gives us a final thought. Again, not Qoheleth's own words. Chapter 12, verse 13. The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments, for this applies to all mankind. Revere God. Now, we have Qoheleth talking about fearing God. We don't have Qoheleth talking about commandments. That's not in this book. It doesn't mean that he doesn't know about it, but he does talk about revering God. You may not know God, but God is there. And God has given us ways to live. We may not always see the payoff either. It would be facile and shallow to insist that everything is always for the best. That's the mistake that Pangloss makes in Voltaire's Candide. Right? You know, why do I have syphilis? You have syphilis because Columbus discovered America, and et cetera, et cetera. And in exchange for the syphilis, you have chocolate too. So it's clearly the best of all possible worlds, because a world without chocolate would also be a world without syphilis, and so on and so. That's already Voltaire making fun of this. Many centuries before Voltaire, Qoheleth says, no, you can't maintain that everything is always for the best, but you can maintain that this is a world created by God, that you're living in it for however brief a span. Do it right. So thank you very much.